Hey everybody, a very warm welcome to this Sustainable Beef Systems webinar. Obviously, we've had quite a inclement week so far, so hopefully everybody's connections and electricity and everything stays going for the foreseeable. But hopefully, we've got quite a good hour in front of us tonight. So this, as I say, is part of the Farm Advisory Service Sustainable Beef Systems project that we've been running for the last wee while. We've had three already. Tonight's the fourth, and the final one will be on fertility on the 27th of February. So just a wee shout out for that one. But tonight we are on grazing strategies, and more specifically to start with is deferred grazing. So looking at that as a system. And then we will, in the questions and later on, move into a bit of a wider discussion in terms of grazing strategies. So today I'm joined by two esteemed guests. So we've got Duncan Miller. The main event is Duncan Miller, and then he'll be assisted or speak alongside Daniel Stout, who's a beef and sheep specialist with SAC Consulting. So good evening to you both. Basically, before I hand over to Daniel, I just want to remind everybody this is your webinar, not ours. So the questions, I'll be fielding the questions later on, but if you've got any questions, stick them in the Q&A or the chat function at the bottom, and let's have as many questions as we can get. The only silly questions are the ones that you don't ask, so if you stick them in the chat, I'll see what I can do with them later on, and we can make this into more of our own webinar. But without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Duncan and Daniel. So I'm not sure, Daniel, are you going first?
I will start. Thank you, Robert. Flattery will get you far.
Over to you.
So as I said, my name is Daniel Stout, and we're joined tonight with Duncan Miller from Tullochgorum Farm at Boatergarten in Straths Bay. And tonight we're talking about deferred grazing strategies. I suppose ultimately, first off, what is deferred grazing? Ultimately, it's the practice of setting aside of pasture in the summer, at some point in the summer, to allow covers to build up to stockpile for grazing in the autumn and the winter, either as a sole diet or supplemented with additional forage or concentrate feed, and also could be combined as part of a bale grazing system where bales are placed out perhaps on a hill or in a field and the deferred grass building up around it as part of the ration. I think ultimately the type of deferred grazing that most people think of will be the one on the left hand side, where you're deferring a hill potentially all summer and grazing out through the winter, and that's quite a common one. It's been around for probably longer than the later. On the right hand side, and we quite often have part of that might be feeding out of concentrate feed later in the season or later into the winter, but we are seeing more and more people doing subdivision of these hills to better ration that nutrition out over the winter and reduce supplementary feeding. But we've also got the right hand side where you can use deferred grazing through the autumn and winter on lowland pasture, but of course you need the right soil type, right climate to facilitate that, and that's a photo of Duncan's farm. Ultimately, why should we bother going out in the middle of winter in the rain, in the snow, with electric fencing and setting up water troughs and all that sort of thing? Ultimately, it's about the cost. It's about extending that grazing season. I don't think we need to ultimately think of deferred grazing as an all grass wintering system. It can just be to extend that grazing season. And if we cost out a bale at about £25, we can actually see that every day at grass saves about £1.20 to £1.60 per head in silage costs. So if we've got 100 cows, it's £120 a day times by 7. That's £840 a week. So even if we can do deferred pasture on one field that maybe is better suited for grazing later in the autumn because of its soil type, even that could save us, for a 100 cow herd, most of £1,000, and that's only taking into account the silage cost, not the additional costs that we can get by reducing a winter housing period as well. When we consider the bedding costs, winter feed, we then consider all the fuel, machinery repairs, because the more machinery is used, the more repairs it needs, to feed, bed, and handle all that manure as well. Although, yes, there's a value to manure, there's a huge amount of work that goes into collecting and putting that manure back on the ground. And caveat here, can, in instances, be an improved labour efficiency through deferred grazing practices, but as can a well-run indoor system as well. So there's a toss-up there. And if we can get to the point where we've severely reduced a winter housing period or even eliminated winter housing, we then also have the opportunity to perhaps reduce our machinery that we have on farm, perhaps downgrade some machinery, reduce the amount of housing infrastructure that we have. So ultimately, there's a huge opportunity cost here, an opportunity saving within deferred grazing. We can be grazing grass in the field, the animal feeds itself outdoors without housing. And there's an absolute multitude of other non-financial benefits that Duncan will touch on a bit later. As I said, it's not an all or nothing system. Even a week is a benefit. Again, why should we do it? Why is that so important for us to reduce the winter housing period, reduce costs? This is 2021 upland suckler herd figures for Scotland for herds selling wean calves. I don't want to focus on the difference between the bottom third and the top third, but yes, the top third has slightly higher output, has a better control on costs, and that is realizing at least a positive net margin. These are margins with all subsidy removed. I think we do have to look at farming in the future as farming at least would reduce subsidies. And either way, would you not want to make a system that is more profitable in its own right and make you more money? But I think the question I want to ask here is how many cows you need to run per labour unit if you're paying a man or just want to pay yourself a fair wage at a net margin of £84 a cow. I think there's absolute need to drive net margin profitability going forward. And that comes from reducing feed costs, but also trying to reduce some of those what people call fixed costs. They're far from fixed when we consider all the machinery involved in those systems. There's opportunity there. People also often pick out depreciation and say that's just an accounting figure, it's not real, but it does reflect your ability or your viability of reinvesting in that system. And if it's not going to pay, you couldn't justify reinvesting in machinery and housing in the same way, particularly without subsidy. There's also considerations here about carrying calves over. We actually see carrying over the winter, and these gross margins were actually probably put where they were poorer with better output, but multiplying fixed costs. As well, what we'll quite often do, and we're probably quite guilty of, is always trying to look at productivity first before costs and consider how can I drive that net output up. But actually, if you look at the stats, those top third herds are already 100 cows. They're rearing 90%. Their calves are weaning at 300 kilos. So actually, their productivity is already good. And yes, we can probably push it a bit further, maybe add 50, 100 quid. But I would argue that do we not need to try and slash out or improve net margin by more than 200 quid to make this a viable enterprise going forward? I think that's where we really need to look at that winter feed, winter costs, because they're the biggest costs in the cow system. Rather than reinventing the wheel with opportunity cost to save, I wonder if anyone here listening tonight has read the last week's Farmers Weekly, which I thought was a great article highlighting the deferred grazing practices that they're implementing on the ANIC Tullochgorum Farm HDB monitor farm, where they have moved from a sort of November to April silage, straw and pot ale in a tub mixer winter feeding system, costed in full at £18.20. These are costings by Rudy and Jones, including all cash costs, fuel, labour, feed machinery and depreciation. So very much an encompassing, fully costed out enterprise. But what they're finding is by taking in a multitude of different types of deferred grazing, including deferring a hill and just grazing that out, they've costed that, including infrastructure, at £1.50 per cow per week, a very big difference from £18.20. They're deferring lower ground hills, similar to what Duncan's going to talk about, and they've costed that out at £7.50. That's with some hay as well. And combine that with still with 8 weeks of housing, they're talking about a cost last year of £200 compared to £364 last year, with this year potential to save £219 when they can further reduce that wintering period. So I think this is where you can see that opportunity to really improve that profitability of that enterprise. Ultimately, it's about finding your unfair advantage on a farm and capitalising on it. We don't all have the land type that might suit it, but if you do, I think it's something you've really got to look at. And I'll pass you over to Duncan.
Yeah, cheers, Daniel. So I'll just explain a wee bit about our farm. We are 500 acres, which is mostly permanent pasture and improved pasture, and a small amount of arable grown in the system as well. We farm on the river space, so at the minute we're all a little bit underwater at the minute, so that brings its own challenges. But down on that floodplains, it's some good fertile land that's capable of growing arable, and then as we kind of go up the hill, it's more permanent pasture and improved pasture that's there, and we're very free draining soil, sandy soils. So the deferred grazing system really suits us in the winter, and equally in the summer we can dry up and drought out. So it's like any farm, it's got pros and cons. We're 100 and roughly floating around the 120 cow kind of mark. Recently all started kind of calving replacement heifers down at 2-year-old. The reason for pushing for that is also for moving into an all spring calving. We were predominantly 50-50 spring and autumn calving. So we thought either calve down at 2 or calve down at 3. So we're pushing to calve down at 2, which touchwood is going okay at the minute. And the spring calving, moving to all spring calving seems to suit the deferred grazing system as well, because we can outwinter just cows and wean the calves off, and the calves come inside for the winter. Yeah, and cows are all outwintered on either deferred grass or forage crops. And we try and finish heifers by 18 to 20 months, mainly off a grass diet, but we do feed a bit of barley as well, just to get that finish on them, to get them away before that second winter, just to try and keep the costs down as well. And the steers are mostly all sold at a year-old. So I'll just kind of explain how we got into deferred grazing. It was winter of 2018. We got the chance to take on a year-to-year, or I think it's a 5-year SLDT, a bit of ground next door that hadn't really been farmed for a good 3-4 years. So there was just this massive amount of tall standing grass, and we didn't really have a clue what to do with it. Not knowing what was lying in amongst it either, gates and whatever and fences. So it was, the first thought was, oh, we need to get a topper in there, we need to tidy that up. And somebody came along and said, well, you've got a heap of standing hay there, get some wires up and get grazing it through the winter. So we had, at that point, that picture there is a group of yearling autumn-born heifers. They weren't in calf, because at that point we were calving at 1.5, calving down at 2.5. So they weren't in calf. We kind of thought that was the ideal animal to try this on, being skeptical of the whole thing. How will they do? How will they fare for the winter on just strip graze, deferred grazing? And yet that kind of really shocked us, and thought, wow, they've done quite well on that system. And that was really we really just winged it through there and just moved the fence every day or every second day and gave them big blocks and just let them get on with it. And it was quite surprising to see how well they did. We never actually took it up again in 2019, but in 2020, we trialed it with just for like November, December with spring cows with calves at foot, and they also did really well. Then moved into winter 2021, where we actually kind of tried to put a wee bit more maths behind it and did a wee bit of a feed budget, a rough kind of feed budget. And we did that with a group of, I think it was, can't remember the number now, but 40 in-calf spring calving cows, no calves at foot, and we grazed them through the winter from November through till February, and yeah, they did really well on it. So from there on in, we've just kind of kept progressing it and added more stock to it, and now, well, by next year, all the back end cows will not be within our herd, so it'll be all spring cows on a deferred grazing system. And we can see there in winter 2023, which is now, which has brought its challenges as well because we've had a bit of snow. So yeah, we've just kept growing the system as we've gone and just kind of learned along the way and kind of winged it. But now trying to get, with a bit of help from Daniel, some feed budgeting and testing the grass, for example, and things. So the way we run our system, we run a loose kind of rotational grazing system. We just move the cattle twice a week, just from a kind of ease of kind of perspective. And we don't quite have the water infrastructure yet either to kind of to move to that next stage of the rotational grazing system. But it's about kind of making the system as easy as possible. So what we'll do is, on some areas, we'll be grazing at the start of the summer, and then once the silage is taken off, silage or hay, and that grass has had a chance to bulk up, the cows will move off the grazing platform and onto the silage ground, and they'll get rotated around the silage ground, which allows the grazed fields to be deferred for the winter. And then, but we're fortunate with our free draining soil and dry ground that we'll take silage off some fields, and then after we've taken that crop of silage or hay, we'll shut them off towards the end of June, July, and we'll run cows through them on the deferred grazing system. Yeah, big benefits for us is it's essentially reducing half in the feed costs. We feed out 50-50 silage, grass, and that's just because we've not got masses of kind of acres to defer, so it's just about extending that grazing for as long as possible. So by feeding a wee bit of silage along with it, that just ekes out the grass for as long as possible. I find this system, it really kind of, when we went for it first in 2021, like going for it properly, we kind of like set aside the field as well. That'll be a reseed, and by the end of the winter, you wouldn't have known that they were there. So that's the big kind of the big yes for me, because it's really an enjoyable experience moving the cattle every day onto a fresh bit, and they're pretty happy and content. Yeah, no establishment costs. We'll do a bit of forage crops, but which is a good way of reducing the winter costs as well. But there is an establishment cost with that. And there's a great story to be told with deferred grazing as well. When we're out and you're moving the fence, you're seeing voles rummaging about in the grass below. You're seeing kestrels above you that are wanting to pick off those voles. So it's a great kind of story for habitat creation and for biodiversity as well. And for feeding out the silage as well, it's a cheap way to get the nutrients back onto those silage fields that we've been taking hay and silage off of. So it's a good way to recycle those nutrients back into the ground cheaply. Let the cow do the work.
Perfect. Thank you, Duncan. I think Duncan's spot on about the biodiversity thing, isn't he? In terms of particularly the more longer kind of hill deferred systems where you're deferring early summer, allowing plants to flower, plants to set seed. You can get a lot more biodiversity there. Also in the winter, you actually got stock on the ground, putting dung back on the ground through the winter for the dung beetles, and keeping that kind of cycle of nutrients going. Also, I think quite a big win for some systems as well is it's facilitated a whole system change, whereby we see at the Alnwick Monitor Farm again, by reducing ewes on the hill, which weren't making as good a profit margin, they've moved cattle up the hill. Cattle go there in the winter. They've actually reduced their silage requirement area by 50%. So that's freed up a lot of good in-bite ground that they've now put down to herbal lays and can put a high production stock on that, be that more young stock, finish more of their own stock, even more cows, or looking at a more of a cross-ewe enterprise. They've kind of flipped that enterprise on its head a bit. There's quite a lot of big opportunities there. What does it require? I think we're not going to go through these together, but there's quite a lot of things to consider, and there's definitely way more than we've got on that list as well. Of course, you need appropriate land type to do it. You can't do it if you're going to end up in a massive mud hole the whole winter. You have to have the right land, be that free draining lower ground, or be it a grazing strategy on farms that are wetter that can manage that poaching, and we'll talk about that later on. If you are on a wet farm, to a degree, it might be possible with paddock grazing, for example, and regular moves might mitigate some of that poaching. So to a degree, your grazing strategy can help you manage that. I think you need the genetics that suit the system. I think I'd probably point out that I don't think a cow that suits outwintering on poor quality feed is probably bred using EBVs, but it's ultimately bred through selection pressure within a system and buying bulls purchased from breeders who are running their studs in a similar system. So you want stock that can survive and thrive on a poor quality system outwintered. Of course, EBVs can be useful, but what we'll find is if we push our high EBVs for 200-day, 400-day weights, that'll ultimately lead to bigger, heavier cows that are less suited to this outdoor wintering system. Likewise, if we chase high milk for bigger weaned calves, we'll have cows potentially that are going into winter with less back fat on them, and again, less suited. Same goes with selection for leaner or other more muscle traits as well. We, of course, for Duncan, what's your kind of sort of perspective on that? Do you think your cow type is going to change?
Yeah, so our cow herd is made up mostly of beef shorthorn and Angus. So we've always run a native cow. Dad's always run a native cow. A big fan of just their ease of fleshing and trying to focus on the ease of calving. But I think since moving to this system and keeping a kind of good eye on the cattle, the Angus seems to be faring the best in the outwintering system. They seem to come through the summer carrying a lot more flesh, and that definitely helps with the system. There is shorthorn cows that are totally thriving in the system as well, but on the whole, it seems to be the Angus that seems to be doing better. So that's, yeah, we've moved. It's all Angus bulls that we're running now, and that's kind of the aim is really well fleshed cattle that are gonna, if they need to, on these hard kind of stormy nights which we've been having, they can also, they've got that extra layer of insulation just to give you peace of mind as well when you hear the wind blowing at the bedroom window and you feel sorry for the cattle outside. But if they've got a good layer of flesh on them, then they're probably going to be all right. And also we don't just have them out on bits that are completely exposed. They've got run backs into kind of wooded areas and bits that are growing with broom and things like that. So they have got bits to go and hide under. So I think that's also kind of important when thinking about where you want to do it.
Yep, absolutely, a big part of the planning process. We'll just rattle through these quickly. You need appropriate shut-off dates, so that we'll talk about that on the next slide, I think, where you're deciding when you're going to shut it off, how's that going to impact the yield and quality. As Duncan touched on, you need a summer grazing strategy that actually facilitates that deferral. That's quite easy if all you're doing is not grazing a hill all summer. You've got that sorted. But if you're on low ground fields, you need to have a system that you're going to have that bulk of grass put aside for the winter. And ultimately, I think in a lot of these systems, that's where the rotational grazing comes in to improve your utilization, consolidate stock in a smaller area, and eke that grass through. As Duncan said, you need a clear plan of what, how, and when to graze. So what stock you're going to graze, what pastures, what fields, and when you're going to do it. You need clear fencing, water infrastructure. There's no good doing it if you can't get water to it, for example. You need the fencing in place. You need a supplementation plan if required, be that to eke out the pasture, or be that to perhaps promote nutrition, for example, pre-calving. If you're on kind of ranker forages, there might be opportunity there or value in giving some sort of supplement. And of course, again, you need a plan for monitoring and also a plan B, as Duncan touched on, with snow and also flooding. You need to have that kind of in place so you don't get caught out. You certainly shouldn't go and make no silage and think you're going to defer graze in year one. You know, this is very much a process that Duncan's seen. You know, he's quite a few years in, and he's just steadily building it up and doing budgets, doing other things to give the confidence to start reducing things like silage. Have you got anything else to say, Duncan, on that sort of the fencing and water infrastructure side of things?
Yeah, we can quite often get hard frosts and kind of minus. I think this year we've had -15 at some point, so that completely buggers that. Sorry, shouldn't say that. Yeah, the water situation. So yeah, having a plan B that, you know, if you've got fresh running water to get back to, that you can fence a bit into to like get their noses into, or there's plenty of people out there that are managing to, you know, pipe out of water course, out of ditches and things like that, and have troughs kind of just trickling over to keep them going without freezing. So yeah, that's one of the main challenges, that you have to get something in place that you can get them to some water. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I suppose in your system, you're quite, in terms of the land type, you can kind of strip graze rather than paddock graze. But if you had to go to paddocks, maybe because you're heavier ground, you need to have that water infrastructure that you can get water to every paddock. So that might be like drag troughs or portable troughs as well. So it's all takes quite a lot of planning, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Shut off date. So when should you shut off that field or that hill? And what would be appropriate, I think, depends on the stock class that you're trying to feed, how much yield you're wanting to get. Ultimately, the earlier that you defer, so if you defer early spring or during summer, particularly during that high growth period, you're going to probably maximize yield, but you're going to compromise quality. So by the time you come to graze it, you're going to have what would be called kind of standing hay. There's going to be a buildup of dead and stem material. But we do know that, you know, a suckler cow of the right type can be carried through winter on hay. So we can make these systems work. We just have to have a plan in place. But if we defer it a bit later, we can be more on the left-hand side, where we can see that the later deferred in the summer, particularly after the reproductive phase, we can carry better quality, more green leaf through. And that might be more suited, for example, for young stock if you wanted to do that system. Do you want to give us an overview of the two fields, Duncan?
Yeah, so on the left is the first year that we did it properly, I would say. Feed budgeted. And yeah, we were skeptical over the whole thing still at that point. So it was, we'll get the grass analysed as well. And as you can see, a 16.9% protein and 10.8 ME was better than some of the silage, or quite a lot of the silage that we made that year. So there is, if you can defer it at the right point, there's still a lot of quality in there to feed that cow. And on the right there, it's middle tomb. We left that. That was an area that we didn't actually graze at all summer. There's a lot more standing hay, a lot more roughage in that, but it's amazing how the cows can actually still kind of make their way through that. And I think there's a place for both. I've noticed this year that the standing, the kind of the bulkier stuff, when the snow comes along, there's grass poking out, which seems to give them a better kind of nose in and dig away at the grass, and they do actually kind of make use of the grass underneath the snow, but with a bit, I don't know, it just seems to hold the snow up a bit as well, so that it gives them a chance to kind of graze underneath it. And what I'm finding now, we've had a hell of a lot of water as well on just, well, the whole farm, but that middle tomb is actually quite a wet hill, and with the longer kind of deferred grass, there's more bulk there, and it seems to be holding the cattle up quite well. So that's kind of what I'm tossing up, is do we go for better quality stuff or longer kind of ranker deferred standing hay? They've both got their arguments. But I think it probably goes back to the land type. And I think the longer standing stuff definitely kind of suits the wetter ground, because it can help reduce that poaching and can help keep the cows up. And the better deferred kind of quality grass is probably better for the freer drained soils that you can maybe, utilize a bit better.
Yep, I think you're spot on, Duncan, or utilise earlier as well before maybe it gets too wet.
Yeah.
I think
There's a
also
question. There's a question here, Duncan. Sorry, I was going to hold all the questions till the end, but this one's
No, fire
for
on.
right now. Is that field across the road? When would that be deferred roughly?
That one, we did silage, I think, at the start of July for that. So that was about then. That was tested 8th of December. So that was the quality then. I'm just
And-
guessing from where that field was, that must have been then around the January time. So you can see that the quality's still holding on, and there's a lot there's dead bits in there as well, but they do, it is amazing to see what they actually will pick away at and get a mouthful of kind of all of it.
Yeah. And from a suckler cow, dry suckler cow perspective, that as a silage would be fairly pokey stuff.
Yeah.
Is there a risk of cows getting fit on this system or not? You know, could we have fat cows by the spring? Or do they tend to monitor or maintain their condition or alter their condition differently when they're out wintered like this?
I think the weather takes a good, fairly takes a bit out of them as well. So I'm not that afraid of kind of fat cows coming to calving, as long as they're not obese. But I think, a good conditioned cow with a easy calving bull will still manage to calve, and it's got the energy to do it. Yeah, I'm not.
We've also got to keep in mind the actual the word fit we always associate with fat cover, but in this case it's actually physical fitness. Like these cows have worked all winter. That actually, if they're fat, they're also fit inside. They're physically. It's a different animal altogether, I think.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there, because we're not back fencing as well. They've got a big kind of range to walk around on, so they are fit when they come to calving. And I'd rather them carry a bit of condition, because it helps them bounce back again once they've had that calf as well. So yeah, I'm not too scared during the winter to, even if they put a bit of condition on.
Do you think they would average at the start and at the end of kind of winter, sort of roughly?
Condition, like body condition wise? Yeah, they'd probably go in like at a 3, maybe a bit over a 3, and then some of them maintain it, to be honest, but then some would be back down at a 2.5. And if there is anything lean, then look at that animal and either taking it inside or keep an eye on it, and maybe don't breed from it as well.
Yep, pull it out the genetics. I think the other point here as well, we can see on the top two versus the middle two versus the crossroad, is that ability of the earlier that you defer it, the more pasture you're going to get, so the higher the yield. But there is going to be a limit to that, and I think it's important to think about that land opportunity kind of thing, because that across the road field could probably grow 8 to 10 tons potentially of dry matter a hectare. But if Duncan leaves that ungrazed from May, he's not going to find himself in December with a crop of grass that looks like a kale crop at 8 ton of dry matter. So you're going to lose that. It's just going to be on the ground. He's not going to have that level of bulk. So it'd be crazy to defer it much earlier, to be fair. You want to get that silage crop off. You want to get 2 grazings out of it beforehand to make use of that better quality ground. Feed quality deterioration is also a kind of a consideration as well. So we know it's not going to end the winter as good as it started. It's going to get snowed on, it's going to get rained on. The plants are going to become more mature, build up a dead. I think this is quite interesting at Duncan. So the wood field is your silage part near the house, Duncan, and the top tomb is actually a field higher up the hill than the one we've seen before. It's probably even more extreme ends of the spectrum, I suppose. That was the wood field last year. July came deferred, hit a drought, did not yield much. So it's sitting at sort of 2.5 ton of dry matter.
Yeah.
But pretty good quality, 10.2 ME in November, end of November, 17% or 16% good protein. But it was interesting, Duncan took it on the 25th of January, and you can see there's a bit of an energy drop, but actually the bigger drop's actually in the protein, going by about, what, 5 increment percentages down in crude protein. The top tomb, which is, how would you describe the top tomb, Duncan? Pretty cocksfoot dominant, ungrazed
Yeah,
that
pretty
year
much.
as well.
That was totally ungrazed, yeah.
Going from like 9.6 ME down to 13% crude protein. So actually still a pretty good feed for a suckler cow. We can see that dropping by whole ME and by, what's that, 4.3, is that good maths? Yep, crude protein. So we can see quite a big drop. And so what's the considerations there? Well, we're trying to graze young stock. We probably want to graze them on the good stuff and graze them on earlier on it. But we might consider for suckler cows, if, for example, we're not housing at all pre-calving, we might actually look to keep some of this better quality stuff to nearer calving if we know that if we keep the rougher stuff till later, it's going to be right down the quality of hay. You know, that kind of may potentially lower than 9% crude protein, which is kind of a kind of go-through threshold for the rumen function. Why subdivide? Why strip graze? Or I suppose the question would be, why does Duncan strip graze in the first place? Why doesn't he just slip them into a field and let them graze it out? And I would see kind of an analogy, if that's the right word, could be this buffet table. So if we think of the cows as a bunch of children being released on a buffet table, say, for example, we've put enough food out there for the children for 7 days. Well, the first thing they're going to do is going to eat far too much. So their intakes are going to be above requirement, and it's not going to last 7 days. I don't see that as a consideration for deferred grazing. I think that's more for example, we use that in a fit condition, maybe autumn calving cows in the summer, where you can pull back on some of their intakes. You'll also do that on a silage diet inside for cattle. But outside, we want to keep them content. We're not really trying to limit intakes. The other big one, though, is utilization. So the kids start knocking food off the table, standing on it. They've wasted the food. And that's exactly what we see in a deferred grazing system. So the more days we keep on going, the more bigger allocations we give, the more up and down they move across the pasture, the more trample, the more waste that we get. So if we're prepared to move from a 7-day to a 1-day shift, our waste will be much lower, and that pasture is going to go a lot further. A lot further means we're going to eke out the pasture through the winter. We're going to reduce our costs even further in terms of winter feeding, delay that housing. Also, a key consideration is balancing nutrition, because the same as the children, the cattle will go in and they'll eat all the sweeties first, and then they'll spend the next 3 days eating bran flakes at the end, because they've eaten all the good stuff. And particularly on poorer quality deferred, there is a key consideration there, because they'll eat all the green leaf and the high protein, high energy feed first, and they might spend the second half of the week potentially even deficient in protein or energy. So I think that is a key consideration. You could see kind of 3-day shifts to balance rations as being probably the minimum that you'd want to do on poorer quality feed potentially. And protein supplements, if required, can be done every second day as well, because you're feeding the rumen to feed the cow, not necessarily the cow directly. You might also consider it as well that this same process also applies on a bigger, larger hill, where if we start subdividing up a hill, we can save the better quality bits of the hill for nearer calving and actually graze out the poorer quality stuff first. So it's just about trying to balance nutrition out. And of course, poaching is always the biggie. You're trying to mitigate that, and we'll speak about that now. I guess the next question would be, why does Duncan strip graze rather than paddock graze? Because Duncan has the good land type that allows him to strip graze without making too much poaching. He can have one water source. The cows can go through the field and go back to it. There probably, some of these fields have done them up to 2 months, and we can see even this year, that's actually, well, this will be this year, isn't Duncan? There is a
That's
bit
this
of poaching,
year, yeah.
but it's not what won't recover before spring. And you can see the cattle there eating through their newest allocation, but they'll be eating the hay, the silage first. Why would you move to paddock grazing on wetter farms? You would do that to try and manage your grazing duration. So by doing that, by putting them in a paddock or putting a back fence up, you're stopping them going back on previously grazed areas. So you're managing grazing duration, and you're also managing the rest period to allow recovery before you want to graze that in the spring or in the summer. We've also got to think about fencing logistics and also the water infrastructure as well. If we're going to move to paddock blocks or how we're going to do it. I'll pass you over to Duncan on that topic.
Yeah, as much as I love the system, it does have bring its challenges. Snow, I think we've had two kind of decent snowfalls this winter. So having a plan B for that, because sometimes the snow can kind of, once it falls, and then if we got a hard frost, it'll just kind of cap, and that's when it's difficult to get through the grazing. So when it does get like that, the allocation is just purely hay or silage. And then once the weather allows, we'll get back to grazing. And when the weather is like that, you can kind of keep them in those fields because it's dry, it's hard. There's no kind of risk of poaching at that point. One of the main challenges I found is when to shut off the fields. This year I probably should have been braver, and I probably could have, after taking a cut of silage, could have probably squeezed in a graze in summer as well and then shut off. But being in kind of on dry land, it's always in the back of the mind that we'll get a dry period and nothing will grow. So that's, yeah, it's believing, when believing that the grass will grow and kind of being brave with that, and making sure you've got enough kind of deferred grass to help you see through the winter as well. And planning where water troughs are going to be, and we've already touched on that with freezing. And even today, I've not put it down there, but with the storms and the wind last night, I went out this morning and I don't know if the electric fence had jumped off and they'd gone through the fence and the wheel was all over the place, and they'd eaten today's allocation of silage and grass, and were standing there quite happy with themselves with full bellies. That's just the joys of electric fencing and things like that. But that comes with its challenges. But I wouldn't say that. Well, it doesn't put me off anyway. Just part of it.
Keeps it interesting.
Yeah.
We'll very quickly just rattle through kind of the basics of a feed budget. Ultimately, why you're doing the feed budget, it's to give you confidence and allow you to budget your allocations. It might be a lot easier if you've got just one big hill. You can measure that, say that how many cow days do I need sorted, I'm good. But for a system like Duncan's with multiple fields of multiple different types and different stock classes, understanding how many cows or young stock that field's going to carry will allow Duncan to then budget not just how many cows you can carry, but also where to add the supplement if he wants to eke it out. So there is a lot of value in it. First off is, of course, estimating yield. You want to do that in tons of dry matter a hectare. You can use a sward stick or a plate meter. Basically, if it's under the height of a sward stick, sort of 15 centimeters. Above that, you need to do what's called the cut and weigh method, and you can see Duncan doing that on the right-hand side. To carry that through an example, you're well, that's online. You can learn how to do that. You're cutting out quadrant areas and then calculating dry matter. The key thing as well is if you're using the actual dry matter percentage of the grass, you want to take a sample on that day. You could use book figures, but it's more accurate that way. This is the cross-road field that we've talked about before. So that yielded 3.84 tons of dry matter a hectare, and that was in 2021. The next step then is not just to figure out how much grass is in the field, but how much grass is actually going to go through the cow. So we're thinking, well, how much are they leaving behind? What's the residual that they're going to leave behind? On rank or taller forages or on more hill-based systems, you might need quite a large amount of residual. You might be a decision to try and limit poaching, but for Duncan, we're basically assuming that he's grazing it pretty bare. They've got access to that for a month or whatever afterwards. So we're going for 1,200 kilograms of dry matter hectare residual. Our next question is, well, how much on top of that are they actually consuming, or how much are they wasting? So what is the utilization percentage? And again, it comes back to generally, what is your days of allocation? So how often do you move the paddock, or how often do you give them their new strip in this sort of strip grazing system that Duncan has? And the more frequently you move, the higher the utilization. This stats, I think, are pretty good. Have come from Kick the Hay Habit, which is an American guide by Jim Gersh. I think it's really worth a read as well. Covers a lot of different environments. So I think it's of quite a lot of interest as well. It does cover environments similar to ours and how they've managed it there. And it really comes back to this frequency of moves. Of course, as well, utilization is affected by the shape of the breaks that you give. So a longer, narrower break with less depth will give you higher utilization. The cows are all spread out along the big line. And of course, the weather as well. And if you're making a decision about leaving more behind deliberately, you've got to reflect that either in your utilization or in your residual. But we feel Duncan's achieving pretty good residuals. So that's what we're going for. The next step then is to understand how much does the cow need. And we would figure that out based on the stock type and performance targets. But in this scenario, you're just trying to get them to eat as much as they can, basically. The go-to guide would be 2% for dry cows, 3% for young stock. For a dry cow, if she needs, for example, 109 megajoules of energy, or 98 if she's losing a little bit of condition, she can consume up to 14 kilos of dry matter at 2%. She can drive 126 ME into her. And as long as it's over 9%, we can see that we can easily make her requirements on these systems as a dry cow. With Duncan, on our feed budget we actually use 1.6% of body weight. We fact-checked a lot of what we've done previously based on actuals, and we've gone for that percentage. Others might choose to use 2%, but they might find that they have to reflect the utilization or the residual slightly differently. It works for us, so we've continued to do it. It's all about estimation at the end of the day, but we've back calculated, which I think is a valuable thing to do. The next thing then, I think this is where probably the key thing is to try and get it into cow days as quick as you can. Talking about dry matter is impossible to visualize in your head. You want to get it to the number of cows that field or that acre or that hectare can graze per day. So if I've got 11 tons of dry matter in that 6 hectare field, cow needs 11.2 kilograms of dry matter. I've got 990 cow days or 165 cow days a hectare in Duncan's in that example. That then gives Duncan the opportunity to budget how he wants to feed out that forage. If he's got 30 cows, he's then figured out that he has 33 herd days. So that group can be carried for 33 days in that field or on a hectare, 5.5 hectare days, but that would be with block grazing out. That then gave Duncan the decision-making tool to think, well, I'd rather they stayed on it for longer. I want to eke that out, reduce the housing period. So by feeding half a bale a day, almost 50% of intake, that allowed him to double his herd days on that field and feed out that 30 bales. So he got 60 days in that case. And you can also then calculate your break allocations, be that with the hectares or acres that they need, or the break width. And there's a series of calculations that you can do for that. But a lot of that as well is about trial and error and adjusting as you see in the field. I'll pass you over to Duncan.
Yeah, if anyone wants a good feed budget done, ask Daniel, because he's given us a pretty awesome Excel spreadsheet that we can plug in different numbers, so what our yield is, and if we're changing the numbers within the herd for where they're going to be. So yeah, he's made a really user-friendly Excel for me to plug in, and it gives a good bit of confidence behind what you're doing as well, that you can plug in what your dry matter of your silage is or your hay is, and you can tweak that. So if you're running through the field a wee bit quick and you want to eke out a wee bit more, then change that allocation to 60-70% silage and less deferred grass. If your aim is to eke the field out a wee bit longer, then yeah, just for if you want to eke it out a bit longer. It's good for adapting to weather changes. So if we do have a good dump of snow, or if there's a lot of rain coming on and we want to move them off, then we can take those days out and we can kind of adapt it. And on the other hand, we can feed a wee bit more grass and hopefully feed a little bit more silage if you've got a kind of target date that you want to take those cows off the deferred grass for maybe taking them in for calving or whatever. So, and it gives you a good kind of aim for what kind of acreage that you need to be setting aside, and how many bales that you might need for that as well. So it's just really good for planning ahead. And yeah, it gives a good clear direction of what way you're going, and yeah, puts a wee bit of confidence behind what you're doing because you've got the numbers to back it up.
Perfect. Just conscious of time, we'll just really quickly rattle through the last couple of slides, just so we can have a bit of questions before we finish. It's of course absolutely essential. All feed budgets, all this is based on assumptions. You have to monitor what's happening in the field, looking at cow contentment, look at your residuals, look at room and fill, look at body condition score. They can afford to lose, but that has to be gradual. You don't want rapid decline. You can look at fecal consistency. I think it's quite a useful tool, particularly to look at whether they're getting enough protein. That's a good poop. It's got that divot in the middle. You don't want to start stacking up and becoming more like horse poop. Then you've probably got a problem with protein or too much fiber or not enough energy. Of course, monitoring poaching and ultimately adapting that then in terms of your allocation, your supplement, your feed budget based on what you see. And final slide, just very quickly, Duncan, future plans.
Yeah, we want to try and make more of the grass, so that'll be trying to improve our rotational grazing, trying to make some better quality silage for young stock because they're housed. We're moving tall spring calving this year, and what I am maybe thinking is putting in calf heifers and first calvers onto a winter forage crop just to give them a bit of a boost after that first calf, just to kind of keep that condition on them, and it'll hopefully set them up nicely for the rest of their lives on a deferred grass system.
I think you're spot on there, Duncan, that if you've not got enough deferred grass for the whole lot, you might as well consolidate the adult cows on it.
Yeah.
Better to your young stock. Grand, we go for a few questions, Robert.
Awesome. Yes, we've actually got a pile of questions coming in, which is great, and we've got time. So I was hoping we'd finish at 8:30, but we'll probably give it another 10 minutes or so if people are okay with that. There's quite a lot to go at. That was an excellent presentation, Duncan. Daniel too, but Duncan particularly. Always good for somebody to open their doors and give us examples to hang a lot of questions on. So one, I think we'll start. Pretty fundamental question is, how do we go about, see, if we're testing grass, how do we actually do that? How do we test what the cow is actually eating?
Yeah, I just tried to be as random as possible and just mimic how a cow would see how the cows are grazing and just take a bit of everything. I wasn't picking out the best of grass when sampling that. It was the brown bits, it was everything that was included in that. So yeah, just try and mimic the cow. For
me, I think it's easier on your type of system where you're eating the most of it. Where I find it really difficult is if it's a deferred hill, it's actually very hard to work out. You can have an analysis comes back that tells you the hill forage is terrible and really fit cows because they've got plenty scope to be selective. Where you're grazing lower, obviously they're being forced to graze the most of it out. The hill question is probably unanswered. It's really about trusting the genetics of the cow, I think. Whereas in this case, it'll really just be a random sample and take quite a lot of stuff and subsample it. Get it as random as you can, as you say. So yeah, ideal. Another question, kind of a few questions welded together, is about how if you're feeding bales out, are you doing that with a bale unroller, a ring feeder, or a variation?
Yeah, we've a hustler bale unroller, and we're rolling that out along the fence line. I find that gets better utilization on the silage. If the electric fence is right there, it kind of acts as a feed barrier. They don't trample it as much, and they really don't waste a lot when it's rolled down a really thin line. There's definitely an argument for trying to take the tractor off the field and maybe looking at quad bike bale and rollers or whatever. But we do get away with taking machinery onto the fields. Maybe less so this year, but on the whole, we really get away with taking machinery on the fields. We don't really leave much of a mark. But that just because it suits our system, that's not going to, suit everybody.
Yeah, I suppose that the other side of that, when we're all feeling really jealous of that, a drought can't be easy either. It's the other side of it's not great. So, a question actually from away at the start that came in really early is about if you've got that really, you've got a heavy clay farm, how do we instill some of this into the system? And I think you've touched on that there, is the tractor's actually quite a big limiting factor. Often for an outwintering system, getting the feeding to the cow is actually the point that when it becomes messy or difficult, it's often a limiting factor. So if we've got bales placed out, if we've got a plan going forward, there is scope to put this into, to instill this into many farms. I actually quite like, a client of mine has started viewing it as a, the long story, sorry, I'm actually asking a question, but I will get to my question. In New Zealand, it's quite often cattle on fodder beet for 2 months. We're trying to do it for 6 months, and it's really difficult. It's a much more protracted grazing period. So from that, he's gone with, why don't we split our winter into 3? Why don't we have 3 blocks? And if we can get a 2-month block or even a 1-month block of something different, that's success. That's a reduction. It's obviously not the 6-month reduction that we want, but if we can reduce our costs for that shorter period, we're cooking with gas. So, Daniel, what about?
I mean, every week's a win.
Yeah. What about the heavy farm? So, we want to do a bit of this.
Yeah.
What do we try and what do we rule out altogether to start with? What's the lessons we've learned from difficult farms in the past?
I think a lot of that comes back. Well, there will be farms that it is just a complete guddle. We've got to be aware of that, I suppose. It's about just trying to extend the grazing. It's not trying about pushing maybe into the winter, but even just deferring it slightly longer into the autumn. I think a big part of that is that grazing duration. So being prepared to move them really rapidly. I think there is a few people, like I don't know if anyone else on the call was on a webinar at 5 o'clock today, where they had the lady from Balsar Glen in Ayrshire, and they are on heavy farm that really would poach up, but they move the cattle 3 times a day on an all grass wintering system, or sometimes with hay as well. But that's how frequently they're moving it to mitigate that poaching. And whilst a lot of people might not go that far, it just depends how much you want it, I guess, as well.
Yeah, and they're doing a great job. In South Ayrshire, they're doing a great job. But again, it's not a typical heavy clay Ayrshire farm. It's they are working with what they've got. Duncan, how much more profitable is this system than the previous system? Have we got? Are you at that stage? Maybe we don't have figures, or maybe you don't want to tell us. But are you seeing a significant difference in profit? Like, are you making money out of cows?
Yeah, I think I can honestly tell you, I've not got the figures to hand, and I've not done a proper kind of cost analysis over it. But I mean, the old system was outwintered on silage and swades, and just strip grazing through that. So we've definitely halved our silage usage, and we're not having to establish a forage crop as well, which is the other cost saving. And then the other cost saving is just by getting rid of the autumn calved cows, because they were housed from kind of November, December onwards right through. So there's a massive saving in straw, mucking out, everything like that. So, but I couldn't honestly, or did we, Daniel? We did actually do a cost.
You could say, for example, if Duncan's half his amount of silage, that's roughly saving about a £5 a week per cow. Times that by 20 weeks, you're at 100 quid. And as he says, that pasture's just growing out the ground. Yes, there's a bit of reseeding at some point on some of the ground, but it's a far cry from growing a forage crop as well, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the one. Is the word holistic's been hijacked by other things as well. But we need to look at this holistically. You know, if you've got a farm that can do this and still graze the following year, it's a true cost saving. If you've got a farm that you can do it, but you've ploughed 11 daylights out it and you've got a full reseed to do the following year, that cost has to be brought into the equation as well.
Oh, if Duncan was getting terrible first cut silages, then he wouldn't be doing what he's doing on that ground. Yeah.
With that in mind, though, I think there's a role for this in the more, not the extreme challenging areas, but the more challenging farms, those that are doing a bit of forage cropping, a bit of something different. This is probably quite a good entry for a forage crop, as if you're going to make a bit of a mess of it, be prepared to use that. You know, are you making a mess or are you pre-cultivating for down the line? So, yeah, and that's
right.
There's a place for that, and certainly I think the thing we need to do here, if we're changing systems, and it's not us touting for trade, there's plenty of other people to speak to, even if it's just people in the pub, but talking through systems, talking through options, going and seeing different options, you will find some system that's going to help on your journey to reduce costs on your farm.
I think you need to get on farms that are doing it and see it in the flesh. You know, go to Duncan Miller's, go to Giles Henry's, for example, and really see it. See it going.
One of the key questions, I think, and I actually, if I put my hand up, I made this question up, but I think it's really important, is transition. So obviously the winter isn't really the issue. Calving is the issue. We want to get them through the winter as cheaply as we can, but we must get live calves on the ground. So how do you handle the transition from winter diet? Is there a transition from winter diet, or have you got a cow that basically just calves in this system and then moves on to grass? So can you explain maybe how your winter to spring transition goes, Duncan?
Yeah, and maybe that's something that we could look at in the future. I mean, I just try to run them as far into the winter as possible on this system, and we'll start calving middle of March. So maybe there's an argument to try and extend it into April, but we've got a short growing season up here, so really, you know, the grass doesn't get going till kind of early May, which then kind of pushes the calving back. So I just see this as, you know, extending it at the time of year that we can, which is the back end. But I wouldn't say I really transition them from a kind of calving diet. They'll come in by into sheds for calving, just for ease if we do need to handle something, and in by fields, and their diet will just contain. It's just all made up of silage. So.
And is there a bolus or anything in there? Are you put minerals into them?
We use a pre-calver tub.
Okay.
Yeah. But no, don't bolus. We've got pre-calver tubs out to them for a few weeks before that. Yeah,
because there is a bit of almost a competition out there as to how little we can put into cows, and as Daniel rightly points out, costs are reducing costs are the mineral story, particularly at that point, is making sure that we've got the cow sitting where we want her and getting those calves on the ground, getting quality colostrum. So I would avoid getting into sometimes the cost reduction can be a race to the bottom as well. Like we need to make sure we know what the good costs are. And I would argue that the pre-calving tub, the bolus,
a real investment,
particularly in a March calving, is really quite important. So any conversations about that should be done not in the pub. It should be done with your vet and with bloods and data in front of you. Two more questions, actually both from the same person. So one is on shelter. So it does look like a pretty exposed farm. Long term, have you got a plan for putting a bit more shelter in, and do they need it? And then the second question is, does this system, are we still really reliant on the new rented ground, or is this system now running across your whole farm, and the new land has basically revolutionised the old system?
I'll start off with the new ground. The new ground is definitely, because it's, I mean, we only took, it wasn't a big parcel of land, and really we got away with it that first winter because most of it is down on a floodplain. So I wouldn't, that's not actually accounted for. That parcel, which is about 50 acres, isn't accounted for in the deferred grazing, but it's, and the other bit has definitely given us that kind of cushion to go into this system. And I mean, I've had bits that have been closed off for the whole winter, for the whole summer, sorry. But that's just purely because we don't really have the numbers yet to kind of get around the whole farm. So it's a case of also trying to add up the numbers and add to the herd. I don't think we've got the right kind of ground to be closing off all summer. So I do want to kind of utilize it through the summer and then close it off. But it's given us that cushion to trial it and keep pushing it, and we'll find a sweet spot at some point where the amount of cows works with the system. And the shelter, yeah, we are really exposed. We've got a few plantations of trees on the farm, which I definitely would plan around the deferred grazing around those to give them, like the last few nights they've been tucked in behind all that. But definitely want to add in hedges along these parts. But we're tenant farms as well, so we're kind of limited to putting in trees and things like that. But hedges definitely.
Yeah, brilliant, good. And Daniel, another one is so obviously our rationing software and everything is all based on housed cows. You know, it's all what cow requirements are based on a traditional system, or what was traditional in the 70s and 80s when it was all developed.
Right.
What's the difference in terms of requirements from a hill cow versus a housed cow? Do we have different requirements?
Outdoors, you'd be looking at 15% more energy.
Yeah.
So we do budget that in with Duncan as well. And then you'd also be considering what is an acceptable amount of body condition score loss as well on that system. I would say on the last point as well, moving from a set stock system, there's two ways of using rotational grazing in the summer. One is to absolutely ramp up your summer stocking rate, have 50% more cows and absolutely go at it in terms of output. The other way is actually just to carry more through into the autumn. And I think it's probably the later that where Duncan's going to see that benefit is in reducing the wintering cost. So rather than trying to match that grass growth curve, trying to drag it across to carry more cattle in the winter on grass, rather than having loads of cattle in the summer with an expensive winter.
And I'll add to that is in a wet summer we'll grow plenty of grass, but in a dry summer, we can, likes of 2018 and even points of last year, the year before, sorry, it will grow kind of nil. So it's, I don't want to get to that position well, it's my dad that said it. He said, I'd rather be looking at grass than looking for grass. So you want to be kind of sitting comfortably in a way and not stressing.
And you could capitalize on excess grass that you feel you have more with trading stock. So for example, carrying your heifers through like you already do.
Yeah.
It's easier to sell them earlier than it is to sell your good cows.
Yeah.
You've got more flexibility in that system, and you could then start looking at store cattle if you wanted to. Or
yeah, that is an option.
Brilliant. So I actually think that's a really good point, probably just to start to bring things to a close. There are lots of good questions that are actually still coming in, which is great.
We'll send them over and we'll email back.
Yeah, that would do. They'll be on here, so we'll get them, get you an answer. But yeah, I've really enjoyed that. There's been a lot of, I'm conscious actually I've been on the screen for some of that with my thinking face on, which is not necessarily the best thing for everyone. But no, really good. A lot of insight here, certainly into an area that we're really, this is nothing new. You know, we've done this for generations. We've just kind of forgotten about it for the last couple. So we're going back into this with great gusto across the country, and it's guys like you, Duncan, coming tonight that sows a lot of seeds and does start to drive a bit of change in the industry. So a big thank you to you. Also to everybody, who's been here tonight as well. The questions have been good. Hopefully it's been really useful for you. There's a short poll to do, which I'm just going to launch just now. It's 3 questions. It'll take like 2 seconds. So basically it should pop up on the screen just now. This is it. Hopefully that's working. This is what we need to drive what we do going forward. So, your feedback's really useful, which someone has answered. So that's really good. Final point, I suppose, this is Farm Advisory Service funded, so big thank you to the Scottish Government. Hopefully it's been useful. We like negative feedback. Positive feedback's good, but negative feedback actually allows us to do things different. So if there's something else you want from this series of webinars, it'd be really good to hear that. So if you want to ping us an email or contact us, that would be really useful. And otherwise, our final webinar in this series will be on the 27th of February, and it's focusing on fertility, particularly bull fertility. So yeah, it's available, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. So basically with that, again, big thank you to Duncan, also to Daniel, and on the Farm Advisory Service website, there's a lot of really good resources on deferred grazing and rotational grazing.